Okay, this is your channel, Stanton Peele. This is we call it Peele Tube. We might even name it. We should rename the channel to that almost. But there was something that was on my radar, and the reason that I wanted to speak first on this is that it ties into a concept that you brought to my attention, and which I understood fundamentally. I understood where you were coming from, and at the same time, I had a different take on it, and I want to. I don't know if let's just say eat crow a little bit here and say it highlight why you might have been right about this predicament. We'll get back to that. What happened was I still watch and listen to the Joe Rogan Experience for all of his faults, for all of his what would you call it, misinformation or kind of strange beliefs. I do appreciate that Joe Rogan has on a range of people who can have long form conversations, and I think he's a good interviewer in that sense. So never ending cast of interesting people. Recently, he had on a man I'd never heard of before. His name's Michael Shellenberger. He is an environmental journalist, and he's written some books. And he's historically a progressive guy, and he's running for governor of California. And one big issue on his mind is the homelessness issue, and especially in San Francisco, but across California, in the cities of California. We've talked about this in the past, but he has this way of thinking that in some part we agree with, that progressives like you and me, I should hasten to say, often have big ideas about fundamental policy changes, and they don't think about the unintended consequences of this big push or secondary consequences and how you might deal with them. In some cases, the argument is that progressives often have a grand idea about things, and they want it to happen philosophically, but they wouldn't want it to happen near them. So, like with the homelessness problem, an idea is, well, we need to get people more homes, but let's just put them in homes where, like, I can't see them, kind of a thing. So that comes back to bite progressive thinkers, and he is one. And he says, well, I want to clean up this mess. I want to be a progressive that has a big idea, but thinks about the sequential order consequences. Well, his idea about the San Francisco homelessness issue and the California homelessness issue is that, no, this isn't about housing. Progressives are getting it wrong. See, he uses this concept, which maybe you and I would agree with in some intellectual way, but I think he gets this thing wrong. So he says progressives are wrong. They don't realize that just getting these people who are homeless housing, that's not going to solve the problem. The fundamental problem is a drug addiction and mental health problem. These people need therapy, they need help, and they need to be, in some cases, people need to be walked into therapy. Like, we need to make sure we're mandating therapy for some of these people because, I've gone around, I'm a journalist, I've interviewed all these people, and they all say, I'm using fentanyl, I'm using meth. These are really bad addiction problems. So this guy Shellenberger has an idea that, well, to solve the homelessness crisis, you can't just give people houses and fundamental, life-enhancing things, because they're not going to know what to do with it when their drug addiction takes hold or when their mental health stuff takes hold. What we really need is to stop punishing people for using drugs and make sure they get treatment. That'll take care of the problem. All right. So, look, an interesting thing about all of this is I thought I had the guy pinned. I thought I understood the kind of person and the kind of argument that he was making. And that's a bias kind of a thing when you listen to a person and you put them into a category, but it's what I was doing. Then he surprised me because Shellenberger, remember, the guy who thinks that the homelessness crisis can't be solved with housing and basic life elements, he starts talking about Carl Hart. And he says, the truth is, I know you've had Carl Hart on your show, he says to Joe Rogan, who I really love. I'm a major fan. The truth is, most people who use drugs, they can just do the drugs and it's fine. But there is that part of the population that when they use drugs, that gets out of control and it takes over their lives. So he's thinking, oh, what I'm focused on is that small percentage of people who use drugs and the drugs addict them. And those are the people who are on the streets. And so that he follows from that, well, I'm compassionate, I'm a progressive, so nobody should be arrested. But, I have some good sense. People should receive treatment. This is interesting for a variety of reasons, which you will respond to in just a moment. The most interesting part to me out of that whole thing was, how can you be actually listening to what Carl Hart's saying and say that you're a huge fan and believe this bullshit that you're saying on the other? How can you come out from it on the other end believing that? And if you hearken back to whenever it was that Carl Hart, by the way, if you don't know, Carl Hart's a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University, who talks about his own drug use and that, people have a misconception about drugs. You mentioned that you're concerned about Carl. Well, first of all, you say, what a brave guy. What a totally sensible read he has on what drugs do and what they don't do. You wish that he talked about addiction more, because eventually you get to the point in the conversation where answering for what addiction is and what it isn't is the most crucial part of the discussion. And I think that this is proven right here, where two people, both Joe Rogan and Michael Shellenberger, who say they're huge fans of Carl Hart, and who I believe, and who I think they've heard all of the information that he's talked about and even understand it, they can't come to grips with the fact that drugs aren't the drivers or the cause of addiction, that addiction is a person's experience and lifestyle, and that to solve for it, people need a connection and really the basic life elements and tools to be able to live their own lives in a balanced way.
Carl does say drugs are not the problem, and that covers two big arenas. The 80 or 90% that Carl says, well, they don't have any problems using the drugs, so why are we even in their ball of wax? And then that other percentage who's running into life problems, but those life problems are emanating from somewhere. And the things that Carl focuses on are, he came out of Miami, are people having, although he doesn't talk 100%, he doesn't focus on the foundational things of work, purpose, having a place to live, having health care. But that's the bailiwick that he's really exploring. You have to give people lives worth living. And what I pride myself on doing is making that link up direct by saying, for Carl, he gets in that trouble because there's two different areas of life: normal drug use and bad negative impact drug use. He doesn't focus on the idea of addiction. And our concept in the Life Process Program, and my concept of addiction, is that people are functioning the best way that they can, and without getting gratifications from their real life connections, their work, their family, their community, drugs become the logical provider of those kinds of satisfactions. Now, how do you deal with that? You start out by saying, okay, and that's and our view of harm reduction is, if that's where they go or need to go to maintain their lives, well, then we need to make sure that we respect that, we understand that, and we make sure that they don't die or anything else bad. In the Life Process Program and in my work with addiction, I'm a little more directed than that. People come to us. We're not picking people up off the street,
right,
who we caught with drugs. People come to us and they say, there's something that's bothering me and I want to try and address it. They've enlisted our help. It's voluntary. Nobody's coerced into talking to us. Well, we have a vast array of things that coerce people into seeking help isn't even the right word, enduring help. And number one is, they could go to jail otherwise, or they've been forced in by even some decriminalization things, say, well, we're going to put you in front of a triage group and they're going to decide why you're taking drugs. And if it's bad, we're going to require you or encourage you one way or another to enter into therapy.
Right.
Our argument is people like to live a good life. if you can offer them, and first of all, if you offer them housing and a place to live, if they're really in that bad a situation, then they themselves can start redirecting their attention to other issues in their lives. And so fundamental for me is the concept of addiction itself. I mean, my view of addiction is an extension of Carl's general sense of the world. People take drugs, hardly any of them get addicted or have negative consequences. Why is it that some of them have negative consequences? And in a way, even Nora Volka, the head of the NIDA, recognizes this. And so what answer is there for that question? And even such great theorists, well, as Maya Salovitz or Nick Heather, their answer tends to be something biological. They'll say, well, in Maya's case, they'll say, well, I have these, learning disorders and these they're emotional disabilities. They fall in one category in DSM, anxiety and depression. And so that's where my problem comes from. My view, and Nick will say something really vague. Nick's a brilliant man, but he has a meme where he says, well, I disagree with some people in the addiction field. I realize cognitive behavior therapy and interventions are very effective, but maybe some people have a genetic cause of their addiction. There's some people maybe out there. Mm-hmm. That's not the way science works. When a principle applies to a human being, it applies to a human being, and you can always work through that version. And so mental illness can be interpreted in the same way we're looking at as addiction. It's a way of getting satisfaction in life, given some fundamental failures that human being is having in getting satisfaction in other ways. Switching to genetics, you can't say that people are addicted by genes. There's no such gene. You can say, well, some people really get a rush from alcohol. That could be a genetic thing. They call it flushing. The only problem is theorists for a long time used flushing as an explanation for why Chinese and Japanese Americans have the lowest rates of alcohol problems. And they say, well, they flush so they can hardly have more than one drink at a time. Boom. Then the highest rate of alcohol problems and alcoholism in the United States is Native Americans. And they say, well, that's because of flushing. They have that flushing trait, and they get such a quick onslaught from the alcohol that they can't control themselves. Is there something that's missing here? What's missing is a picture of the entire person, which is a theory of how their whole life fits together with the substance. So where Nick will throw in the gene at the last minute, with Carl, I find the discontinuity being, well, some people have problems, but that's sort of not my bailiwick, except in a social stance. Right. Obviously, we have all ghetto population where people can't work or get any kind of satisfaction. That's going to generate a lot, which is true. But we need a fundamental model. And the problem that I identify with Nick, Maya, and Carl, all of people I have great respect for, is that none of them comes with a psychological model of addiction. All of them know my work. They've read some of it. And when you get down to the basic brass tacks of comprehending an addiction as being a function of a lack of connection to essential gratifications for which something rushes in to provide the alternative, and that may be where they're at. But if you're talking about addressing addictions, you need to expand the base of their framework, which Carl would recognize would be social improvement of swaths of the world, but which none of them really focuses so much on as being improving their overall ability to relate to the world. So I mean, Maya Salovitz she calls herself a neuroscience journalist. She's not really a psychological thinker. Carl Hart they call him a neuroscientist. So much of his work is involved with drugs and impacts on the brain and behavior. He doesn't tend to dwell on psychological thinking. The funny thing about Nick is he does, but he switches off in certain areas. And one of those areas is this, well, some of those people have a genetic predisposition. He also is a believer in the public health model of alcohol problems, which is the more you drink, the more problems you have. And yet Nick, all of this is, I've discussed in my memoir, Nick did a study called Cultural Delusion of Alcoholics, that alcoholics are more likely to accept the idea of one drink, one drunk, and are more likely to relapse after treatment because they believe that. It's the mind component is really critical in all of that. And what he's getting into is an individual conception of substances and its impact on a human being. But he doesn't do that at a cultural level. None of them. I mean, Carl talks about having been overseas, but not Carl, not Nick, who lives in the UK, not Maya, who for a long time had a Scottish boyfriend, not Bill Miller, reflects on the cultural variations and the experiences and the attributions we make towards alcohol and drugs. Mm-hmm. So what I feel like that gives me a firmer foundation for thinking about cultural drift. Why are we getting worse in the United States in a number of mental health and drug indicators? It's because we're losing a self-efficacy on the one hand and a sense of community on the other. And it allows me to key in on when somebody has a substance problem, while we recognize that it's not our business to force them to improve. I understand that the dynamics and the dimensions of improving people's lives comes out of assisting them to function and connect in those lives. And now there's a smooth transition to where Carl Hart comes from, because one way of doing that is to help people find jobs, and in a writ large, one of a helpful way to do that is to give people a place to live, to give them a place to go and a sense of community, to give them health care, to give them training to help them get jobs. That's completely continuous with my model of addiction. And so without that way of thinking about it, I fear they miss the boat, both at an individual level of how we approach things and at a cultural level, which is getting back to where, we began this discussion. Let's force people to get treatment, and then they'll be able to overcome a need for addiction, because really they're using a disease model. They're failing to see the totally integrated way in which drugs, addiction, and people's settings and outlooks all come together.
You talked about Asian flush. That I like that example because you have two sets of contradicting empirical claims about empirical evidence. So you have Chinese and Japanese people who they experience flush, and so do indigenous people. They will experience flush, and then the idea of flush is an explainer on the one hand to say, well, that's why people of Asian descent tend not to drink or become alcoholics. But then on the other hand, it's why people who are indigenous people do become alcoholics. It hits them so hard. And obviously there's just something missing there. And it's the idea that, so what? All right, someone becomes flush. That has nothing to do with why they might like something, why they might take on an involvement and make that involvement the core of their lives and drift away from other areas of their lives. There's just so much missing there. The gubernatorial candidate that I was talking about, Shellenberger, I think he sees part of that issue somewhere along progressive ways of thinking, because he hears people who are homeless on the streets of San Francisco will just give them homes, and he's thinking, I don't think that's all you need to do. So there's some correct step there in his thinking. So he says, "Oh, it's not just about only giving them homes. Obviously, that's a resource beyond what they have. But whatever problems they have in life, they're still going to have their problems." But he just decides to go and get caught up in that contradiction somewhere else in some other realm. I like what was her name from Portland Hotel Society? You know what I'm talking about.
That's a really good example. Yeah, Evans is the woman. Liz
Evans. She, when I talked to an author who wrote the story of Portland Hotel Society and also people in Vancouver, he wrote this book, and I asked him, well, did Liz Evans have a really overall conceptual framework of the steps that she needed to take to improve people's lives? And he said, look, I don't know, I'm not her, but from what I understood and from what she told me, not at all. She was just like a good person. So she started out, she wound up with a really good understanding, but she started with, there are people without homes. It'd be nice if you could give them homes. And then she would look at the problems that they have once they get in the homes. Oh, they don't have a work. We should be helping people with the homes be involved with some kind of work if we can. Oh, they don't have, the list goes on. So her thinking was, what does a person need in a moment? Then what will they need? Let's look and see. That's like the most, that's Stanton Peele level thinking. That's what you're saying. To strip it down.
I've had the oddest experience with Liz Evans in the world. To describe in my memoir, I was giving a talk in the International Harm Reduction Association in Liverpool. And Liz Evans said, well, I'd like to meet with you. And we met. And Liz Evans, her father's a big doctor, but she's not an intellectual level worker. She's a people person. And what she was expressing to me was that, and Gabor Mate was their go-to physician. He was the community physician. He cared for people, and they all loved him. And where her problem was she had diseased people in her group, but what you said, she knew. They ran their own bakery. She realized they needed basic skills and services so that people would go to work in the bakery. They needed housing, obviously. They needed to, she created her own bank. That's a Liz Evans way of doing things. Well, let's start a bank. And what she was providing people with was the mechanisms for tying into life.
Right.
She saw that my approach was her approach, but she doesn't have a theory. Liz Evans is in theory people.
So she thought you had to say, how do I explain what I'm doing for people?
Right.
Seems like you know.
And she did invite me to Vancouver, and I talked there, and I was amazed. I thought she has a ton of community workers. I thought, well, they're providing housing, jobs, a bank, and other services, they'll understand that we're not talking brain disease theory. But when I worked with the group, they kept spilling out brain disease theory things. And I just couldn't understand the disconnect. It was more like I'm sitting there saying, wait a second, don't you realize that what you're doing in Liz's model is a refutation of the brain disease approach? It's working at an entirely different level with humans. And so that was not an entire, I was invited to speak at the major, and they have Insight, which is on-site drug consumption sites, which is a part of their whole program. They were the most unified services provider. I was invited up there. They generously brought me up there. They sort of made me, a star for a little bit in Gabor Mate's backyard. And yet I was having a fundamental disconnect with their basic conception.
Yeah.
Liz doesn't have Liz has a gut feeling of where I'm coming from. She has a gut feeling about AA people that they're not, they're some of whom were on her team. They're not talking about what I'm talking about, but she didn't have a conceptual way of packaging that all so as to understand what their direct basis was and what she could educate her group is doing. I also work with the Above and Beyond group in Chicago, which is, basically my philosophy. They're a housing group, a training group, a health group. And I'm always amazed at the extent to which people working in a context, which is me, that's why they brought me on as an outside advisor to their board, are still utilizing old concepts. Because the need to shift to a different way of thinking about addiction is evident to them. And more than that, they can't imagine a different way of thinking about addiction. Addiction is this. Why fight it? Why would you say otherwise?
Man, is it fair to say that I'm like I to you right now in our relationship, working relationship, and otherwise, I'm sort of like Liz Evans if she wanted continuing education from you, if she wanted to continue to understand and stick with you, because I feel like it wouldn't take much for her to give the presentation and easily describe your kind of way of thinking or put words to the way that she already thinks about the world.
I've seen Liz Evans give presentations, and she talks about the need to help people, with housing and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. You have, thanks for bringing, it's a little bit of a misdirection end to our little talk here. You've always had a gut feeling for what I'm saying.
Right.
First of all, working with kids helped you. Then your own personal philosophy and how you interacted with drug problems that you yourself had, where you would say you were addicted, but you're not an AA guy or a treatment guy. You didn't do those things. So you had your gut feelings were my gut feelings. We're coming from the same place, partly due to the fact that, I'm currently twice your age or more. But my cast of mind is to put that all together in a ball of wax. And, you're in a position to, to put them into action and to integrate that way of thinking with a mode of helping people. That, in a way, Liz Evans, she's older than you, and, she had a giant success. By the way, she's no longer at the Portland Hotel Services. She ran into some, I'm sure she's as honest as the day is long, but she wasn't a good businesswoman as well. Mm. And so they found loose ends in her accounts. I don't think anybody thinks that they were misappropriating funds, but, it was government money. You do have to tell them where it came from, where you spend it. So she lives somewhere. I don't know 100. She lives somewhere around New York City now. She might be doing. What's that?
So I didn't know that.
And she's doing some kind of an active program, but and Portland Hotel Services exists. It can never have her in unbelievable energy. She's, but as far as I'm aware, her life has shifted away from being a mainspring of a new kind of way of thinking of addiction. So, it's one more story in the big universe, that I always refer to. The Naked City began at the television series. There are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. And I think she's now, someone involved on the sidelines in New York City.
I've always thought it would be the greatest book if you and Carl wrote a book together. I don't think that he sees things the way that, I see just a linear thought process across his specialty and understanding of drugs and what they do and what they don't do, physically in a chemistry sort of a way. His understanding that there are people in the country who live deprived lives and lifestyles, and those need to be addressed. And then your way of tying it all together and understanding the full scope all the way to the end of what we would need to do to help human beings counteract any destructive
It's funny you
forces.
bring that up. I think this is in my memoir too,
Mhm.
A Scientific Life in the. When I first met Carl, the first time I met him, he was giving a little workshop, and he came up and said, "Do you have these same kind of problems dealing with people?" Because people were saying, "Wait a second, he's saying heroin doesn't addict you instantly."
Mhm.
At different times in when I would see Carl, he'd hug me, and he would say things like, "You're my role model," and all, and then he would say things like, "Well, you'll have to come to Columbia. We'll have to lecture together." And when he took off a kind of a big, Carl can write. He took off a big hiatus to write a book. I actually suggested that maybe I could be helpful in that process. But that further connection, I'm sure do as much or more to me as Carl, never took place. There was kind of we're drawn together by some natural inclinations and certainly our ways of thinking. Carl, when he interviewed with you, said, "Well, I would go and rush off and read Stanton's work," his way of saying, well, what they're saying doesn't make sense. But those are the Liz Evans and Carl Hart are two loose connections in my life.
Maybe that's just another thing in life that I need to do is write the Hart Peele philosophy of drugs and addiction after I write my book about education.
We're going to be around for a while. You can do all of that. So this has been a little section of Peele Tube where we've talked about my personal engagement, my approach, and where I see, thanks to you, integrating it, all the elements, disparate elements in the addiction model that others touch on one part or another. Carl and Liz Evans touch on, but isn't fully made a part of the overall picture, which is what my work has tried to do.
Well put. Another good one, Stanton.
Au revoir.